Good afternoon. My name is Todd Rosenblum, and I am the Interim Director of Third Way's National Security Program. And we're very excited you're here with us today. We appreciate your time and we appreciate the time of our panelists. We have 1 hour for what I think will be a pretty deep discussion. We're discussing ransomware, which is a topic when we first thought about doing this event. We thought we would be having to generate some interest in it. And then lo and behold, the world has really turned upside down to a certain extent in terms of the volume, the speed and the scope and scale of the ransomware attacks affecting both private sector and public sector institutions. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge for the nation. And that's why we're so pleased to have with us today 3 senior officials from the executive branch. We have Mr. David Smith from the U.S. Secret Service. And David has been with Secret Service now for about 20 years. He's the Deputy Assistant Director within the Office of Investigations at Secret Service Headquarters. And in his current role, he oversees headquarters-based investigative divisions and a segment of Secret Service field-based operations. David has served as a special agent in charge within the Criminal Investigative Division. He's also served in the field. He was an assistant to the special agent in charge in the Los Angeles field office and started his time in Secret Service in the San Francisco field office. So let me introduce our other panelists, and then what I'd like to do is ask each of our 3 panelists to make some remarks to set off our discussion today. Next, we have Mr. Matt Hartman. Matt serves as the Deputy Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at the DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Now, I'll begin with the first question, CISA or CISA, what is your preference?
CISA.
CISA, good. That's how I like to pronounce it, and that's now the official lexicon we're going to be using.
Perfect.
So, before his current position, Matt served as the Associate Director who led CISA's Cybersecurity Services portfolio and the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation and the Quality Service Management Office. In those roles, he oversaw CISA's efforts to drive adoption of national level cybersecurity strategy, policy standards, directives, and requirements across stakeholder communities. Matt has also served as the Director of Federal Network Resilience and as a cybersecurity counselor to the Secretary of Homeland Security. And finally, we have Mr. Herb Stapleton with the FBI. Herb is a Deputy Assistant Director in the FBI Cyber Division. Herb is responsible for the FBI's operational programs targeting sophisticated cyber threats from criminal and nation-state actors. And prior to this role, he has served as the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Cincinnati Field Office. Before joining FBI, he practiced corporate and commercial law in a private law firm. So I want to welcome all 3 of you here today. And I'd like to turn first to David to make some remarks to help us understand from the perspective of Secret Service what is going on, where Secret Service fits in the equation for helping address ransomware challenges we face today, and any other issues you would like to raise in some remarks before we turn to questions overall. So David, I turn the floor to you.
All right. Good afternoon. Thank you, Todd. Thanks for everybody for attending today. The first thing I'd like to get out of the way is to explain to some of the folks in the audience who may be asking, why is the Secret Service here talking about ransomware as opposed to ruining traffic around the national capital region, while escorting dignitaries around town. Many of you on the call do know that our original mission was to suppress counterfeit currency within the United States and beyond, obviously. So our original mission is protecting the financial critical infrastructure of the U.S. Financial system. That originally came in the form of suppressing counterfeit currency, but through time, that paper threat has turned to plastic, now to digital. So obviously, we're still in the process in the business of protecting the financial critical infrastructure. We do that in various forms. Like I said before, we have to be as contemporary as the mission dictates. It is not our expectation in law enforcement that everything always works to our favor. There's going to be an evolution in the threat. Know where you position yourself within law enforcement is the threat going to remain the same. So we don't have the expectation of the Secret Service as well. But we have to move forward knowing that we have to work with our law enforcement partners, work with partners such as CISA in order to defeat the threat of ransomware and other technological advancements. One of the phrases I like to bring up is there's no honor amongst thieves, but there is coordination amongst thieves. So with that, we have to coordinate the same or to a greater extent and able to fight the threat of ransomware. So we do that with our partners at the FBI, especially through the NCI-JTF, which I'm sure Mr. Stapleton will talk about, and with our partners at CISA within DHS. So they team up, so we have to team up as well to fight the threat. I look forward to answering some of your questions and delving into this a little bit more as we progress through this hour, but I'll kick it back to Mr. Rosenblum.
Great, thank you, David. And I remember from my own time at DHS, first coming to appreciate the significant role the Secret Service plays in fighting cybercrime. I remember going to the New York field office and being both disheartened and heartened by the people up there trying to combat it. So we very much appreciate your remarks. Matt, why don't we turn it over to you?
Sure thing. Appreciate it, Todd. Again, my name is Matt Hartman. I'm the Deputy Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity here at CISA. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today and to discuss this increasingly concerning and important topic. Just to give all of you a little bit of history on CISA, which will be brief, especially compared to my colleagues from the Bureau and Service. We are the newest agency in the federal government, although many of our functions and roles have existed now for the better part of a couple of decades. In 2018, Congress established CISA as the first federal agency solely dedicated to protecting and enhancing the resilience of our nation's cyber and physical infrastructure. It is our job to take on some of the biggest challenges facing both government and industry, from securing large federal networks to securing our election infrastructure to partnering with the other folks you see on the screen here today to combat a growing ransomware epidemic that is impacting the functions that we as Americans rely upon every day. So to say that our mission set has grown substantially in recent years would be an understatement. And this is really because Americans are increasingly aware that many of the risks that we are facing are complex. They are dispersed both geographically and across a variety of stakeholders. And quite frankly, they are very challenging to understand and to address. So this is where CISA comes in, and really we serve as the civilian government's central coordinator of defensive cybersecurity operations and as the nation's risk advisor to address national level risks. Each of these roles requires us to work hand in hand with our partners across government as well as across industry. Admittedly, this mission is vast. It is increasingly complicated. So to help us narrow in on our efforts, we have set out two strategic goals for CISA as an agency. The first goal is to defend against urgent threats and hazards that are facing our nation's critical infrastructure. And the strategic theory here is that by using a collaborative risk management approach, we can prioritize the most urgent risks facing our country. We can collaboratively plan on how to address those risks, and then we can drive results against those priorities. Our second goal is to work with our partners to strengthen the cyber ecosystem and address longer-term systemic risks. I'm sure that this is something that will resonate with all of you in your various lines of work, but it's really no different for us at CISA and in government. If we are always just putting out today's fires, we will never get ahead. So we are also working to build capacity in our partners and drive ecosystem change to shift the advantage to network defenders. This requires collaborative planning to identify long-term common outcomes, like recommended security measures or capability maturity levels. It also requires creative and strategic thought about how we can make long-term changes in the broader ecosystem. For example, how can we make network devices more secure out of the box? How can we ensure that there will be an appropriate national cybersecurity workforce a decade from now? What innovations do we need to really change the paradigm? All of these questions require the same model of collaboration and risk management planning to achieve our desired end states. And really, as we focus on decomposing these broad, very broad strategic goals into operational priorities, there is one consistent theme, and it is that partnership is core to everything we do at CISA. Our core mission is to bring the public and private sectors together in a collaborative effort to strengthen our nation's cybersecurity, physical security, and emergency communications. And it's through these partnerships that we provide services across all sectors, as well as to the international community, that is driven by our agency's comprehensive understanding of the risk environment and the corresponding needs identified by our stakeholders. Our mission every day is to help organizations better manage risk and increase resilience using all available resources, whether provided by the federal government, commercial vendors, or their own capabilities. At CISA, we have a library of resources and services that we offer to all US-based organizations across both public and private sectors. And our goal is really to be the front door to the federal government on issues related to cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection. That is certainly not to say that we're the only door, and my colleagues sharing the virtual stage with me today have complementary services that they can offer that may be more useful to your organization depending on the situation you find yourself in. But we are really looking to move to a model where if you call one of us, you call all of us. We work every day with the Bureau and the service to identify our various authorities, responsibilities, and capabilities, how they intersect, and how we can best serve all of you and our American citizens writ large. So I look forward to discussing in a bit more detail potential areas of partnership with all of you in attendance today, and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Matt, thank you. That was really terrific. And I know we've got people participating today that were involved in actually getting the legislation over the finish line in the establishment of CISA. So to those people, I say thank you. And it was a really important change in our structure of national government in terms of approach. So we'll get to that a bit more in the question and answers, but I just wanted to acknowledge the significance that we actually have CISA here today from where we were just a few years back. Herb, can I turn to you now to give some remarks, perspectives you bring from the Bureau?
Absolutely. And Todd, thank you very much for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to share this forum with David and with Matt, who I've worked with on a number of things in the past, and really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have. I think I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about where we see the FBI's role in the overall cyberspace. I think colloquially around the FBI, we like to refer to cyber as the ultimate team sport. It's not something that the FBI can do alone. It's not something that we want to try to do alone, but I think we do occupy a really unique space within the US government's efforts to combat significant cyber threats. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Our goal really is to impose risk and consequence on the cyber threat actors who would do harm to our most sensitive technologies, to our intellectual property, and to our critical infrastructure, whether that means through theft or disruptive or destructive attacks like ransomware. At the end of the day, while ransomware is an incredibly important topic and one that I'm happy to be able to talk about today, it's just one tool in the tool belt of the cyber actors who are using a myriad of complex techniques to try to accomplish their ends. From the FBI's perspective, we seek to impose that risk and consequence through a number of ways. One of those is by utilizing our unique authorities. The FBI sits as both a law enforcement and an intelligence agency. And in that particular sort of unique blend of authorities, we have the ability to both enable our network defenders like CISA and others within the government, as well as the private sector, to work shoulder to shoulder with our law enforcement counterparts like the U.S. Secret Service and our state and local partners that we work so close, and other federal partners that we work with every day. And then lastly, to be able to enable all the tools and instrumentalities of government power, potentially on the offensive side, to try to ensure that there's some form of deterrence against the types of cyber threats that are launched against us either by hostile nation state actors or by organized cyber criminal groups on a daily basis. Another key pillar of our strategy is those enduring partnerships. And, you heard both David and Matt mention those partnerships, and that is no accident. In my view, the US government is more unified than it's ever been with respect to battling cyber threats. I think we have a really strong common understanding among the key partners as to what those roles and responsibilities are, as to how they complement one another, and what we can do together to work against those threats. And you heard David mention the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, which is just one of a few platforms that we use to formalize and bring those partnerships together so that we can collaborate. We can pull in government agencies from the law enforcement arena, from the intelligence arena, from the defense arena, and work together to try to develop whole of government campaigns that disrupt the activities of these hostile actors. So I'll just close up by saying this. This landscape, the cyber criminal ecosystem, is a complex one. It's constantly evolving. The actors are more sophisticated than they've ever been. And I think that we here at the FBI recognize that it's going to take everyone in government working together, and not just government alone, but working together with the private sector to make sure that we are safer, more secure, and can have more confidence in the digitally connected world we live in. Thank you.
Herb, thank you. And really, I'd like to underscore the importance, as you've said, about the unique authorities, the investigative and intelligence authorities that the Bureau brings to bear in this challenge. It's really a tremendous asset, I believe, in being able to understand and then act on threat. Let me open up to each of you a few questions, because I'd like to sort of level set in terms of making sure we're all clear what we mean by ransomware. And then after that, also, why the uptick now? What's happening in the environment among criminal organizations, among nation states, individual criminals? Why are we seeing such an upsurge at this period of time? Herb, why don't you go first, since you were last up?
Absolutely, I'd be glad to. I'll start with the part of your question about why we're seeing the surge or the uptick in ransomware. And I think there's a really simple, straightforward answer, and there's perhaps a little bit of a longer, more complex one. So I'll start simple, which is it's profitable. At the end of the day, most of these actors who are launching ransomware attacks against entities within the United States and elsewhere around the globe are interested in earning a profit. And so as they have seen that this type of activity continues to bring in revenue and to be profitable, that has continued to fuel the efforts of these organizations to launch these attacks for a profit motive. The more complicated answer, I think, is that this has been a long sort of climb uphill, unfortunately, toward more and more ransomware attacks dating back several years. And it's somewhat by coincidence that we didn't previously experience some of the more disruptive type of activity that we saw with recent attacks against critical infrastructure that disrupted fuel supply in large swaths of the country, or other types of disruption to critical infrastructure. And so I would say there's a couple of factors that have lent itself to more and more of this type of activity. One is the ability to readily get hands on the tools that are required for a ransomware attack. Sort of a malware as a service or ransomware as a service type of model has allowed less sophisticated and knowledgeable actors to be able to essentially purchase off-the-shelf items on the dark web and launch those attacks with relatively low barriers to entry from a technical sophistication standpoint. And also the rise of virtual currency has made the monetization of cybercrime and ransomware in particular easier and more anonymous than it's ever been in the past. And so really that confluence of factors has led us to the point where we are today, where, as I think it's been described a couple of times by my colleagues, and our own directors even refer to it as an epidemic. It's reached epidemic levels. Hence the reason for this conversation and the need for partnership in the government.
David, from your perspective at Secret Service, what are you seeing that is new and different from what you were seeing even a year or two ago? Herb was mentioning the role of cryptos, helping to make this easier to stay anonymous, not fully anonymous, but more anonymous. But from your standpoint, what are you seeing that is different now than it was just a short period before?
And you mean different from the standpoint of adding to the acceleration of the
Yeah,
leveraging?
the drivers, the incentives,
Right.
even the tactics and techniques.
One of the main things, I'm going to echo what Herb said, is the profitability of it. I mean, back in 2013, with Crypto Locker, where they used the ransom was 2 Bitcoin and pretty much $400 at the time. Those payouts have significantly increased. And one thing we keep in mind in law enforcement, every time there's a successful attack and a ransom is paid, obviously you finance those entities or those criminal enterprises to operate that much longer, because they've gotten some more funds in order to fund their criminal enterprise. The copycat element of this is undeniable. Once one bad guy sees that this works, or one bad organization sees that this works, you're obviously going to have some additional parties looking to leverage that same playbook until folks realize that law enforcement and groups such as CISA are on to the scheme and are able to thwart it in whatever way we can. But as far as one of the things I do want to bring up in regards to it being new, I think it's on top of everyone's mind now because of some of these several high profile incidents that have occurred of late. And obviously there's a very focused effort on the administration, the current administration, for industry and the general public to be aware of ransomware. But folks in the know have been, ringing the bell on ransomware for quite a while now. And, obviously sometimes it takes the general public or industry a little bit of time to focus on some of these matters. But when you talk about 2 or 3 years, we're kind of seeing what I was seeing 2 or 3 years ago, to be honest. It's just that it's top of mind now because you have critical infrastructure being impacted. But 2 or 3 years ago, folks were saying, hey, if we don't get a handle on this, at some point, folks are going to be attacking critical infrastructure. And now we just happen to be here.
Yeah, and I think David has hit that spot on. This has been a challenge for many, many years now that the public is just now really starting to take interest in based on some recent attacks. But just to elaborate a bit on one of Herb's points, I think one disturbing trend that we are seeing is ease of access in the rapidly growing ecosystem that is supporting ransomware. It used to be that ransomware gangs had to do their own work, which made the barrier of entry a bit steeper. Today, what we're seeing is an affiliate model with broader ransomware franchises, with specialized brokers. Some are specializing in initial access, others are specializing in post-entry exploitation. So these criminal gangs no longer have to do even their homework on targets, both in terms of exploitability and also in terms of likelihood to pay ransom. They can purchase this information from a third party now for a nominal fee. We're even seeing third-party dark web escrow services managing and apportioning ransom payments to different actors. So the attacks that previously took weeks or months to plan and carry out and required more resources and more sophistication now really only require desire and a few hours. The other challenge with this model is that it creates a bit of a haze, and it makes it difficult for the US government and for national governments to really focus efforts and resources. So unfortunately, as long as organizations keep paying ransoms, we fear that the ecosystem will continue to grow and thrive. And this really is an epidemic that is now affecting cities and hospitals and schools and manufacturing and other critical infrastructure targets. But to David's point, the US government has now dramatically ramped up our efforts to combat this threat. And these are being driven by the highest levels of government. And all of us on screen will continue to focus on this problem every day until we have adequately reduced the risk.
So to that point, Matt, on traditionally, we have viewed attacks on critical infrastructure as as a different a different level of attack than attacks against individuals or private sector organizations, as costly as those attacks are. Is this the new permanent state for us, attacks on critical infrastructure? It just strikes me that this was a threshold just a bit ago that we were all concerned about. And David, you were mentioning this in your remarks, but is this the new normal? This volume of attacks against critical infrastructure?
So I'll start and then turn it to my colleagues. I don't think it is. I would surmise that this red line has been crossed a few times recently, very recently, that are all on the top of our minds. But it is something that we as a nation certainly have not accepted as our new normal. You know, at the highest levels of government, we have bolded and underlined previously drawn red lines. And quite frankly, you know, the attacks on Colonial and the attacks on JBS, I think they illustrated to cyber criminals exactly why these types of attacks on companies that provide services to critical services to our citizens are not ideal targets because of the attention that they will receive from the US government. With that said, you know, at CISA, our approach is holistic, and it's really to address all risks and hazards, and we prioritize those that we consider systemic in nature. So we will continue to focus every day on providing resources to all organizations, both public and private, both small and large, to help them protect, detect, respond, and recover from ransomware and other types of cyber threats. And we will continue to work alongside you know, the Bureau, the service, and other government partners, as well as private sector partners every day to continue to work to disrupt the criminal use of cyberspace by building stronger relationships across the ecosystem and improve our, you know, sharing of incident reporting and other types of intelligence.
Herb, so are we looking at, in addition to any thoughts you have on what Matt was just saying in terms of how we permanently cross the red line of attacks on critical infrastructure, are we needing to change the way we look at the threat actors? Are these transnational organized crime groups like we would treat the cartels historically for drug trafficking and other illicit trafficking? Is it that organized? Is it still atomized and not quite so centrally directed by individuals and individual groups? Or what are we looking at in today's environment?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question. And I would just start by saying I agree with what Matt just said. Like, I don't think we should accept this as the new normal. And, you know, while from a policy perspective, it's really, really important for us to consider, you know, where we draw lines as far as critical infrastructure goes. I would say from a law enforcement perspective, these are all federal crimes. We call them attacks as sort of a shorthand sometimes, but you know, from our perspective, no matter who the victim is, we think it's incredibly important to investigate the cases that underlie these and try to bring those responsible for justice. And so that really kind of brings me to your question, which is, you know, how do we do that with these particular groups, or what do they look like? You know, I think we're facing really kind of a blended threat in this realm. Many of these are well organized, if loosely affiliated, but maybe loosely affiliated, but well organized and very specialized groups with with sort of the affiliate model that we see very frequently in the ransomware space. Many, if not all, of the main actors, affiliates, developers, administrators are located outside the United States, and so it's really a global problem that we're looking at. And then we have occasionally seen in the ransomware space areas where contractors or people affiliated with nation state actors might moonlight or do things sort of off duty as on their own in order to you know, profit from ransomware attacks. And so we're really looking at a broad spectrum of different types of actors. And from my perspective, that means that we have to continue to sort of follow where the evidence leads, you know, gather the most intelligence that we can about what these groups look like, and then importantly, use the tool that fits the best to what we're trying to accomplish. So in some examples, that tool might be a law enforcement tool like an indictment and an arrest. In other places, that might be a different kind of tool of government power, maybe sanctions or seizures of illicit proceeds. And so finding the right tool for the job based on who the threat actor is that we're facing is a really critical part of what we're doing in partnership with the rest of the US government.
David, can you talk for a bit about the role of safe harbors and how significant is that? And I ask this question, obviously, from a US perspective. There seems to be consensus building that Russia is providing safe haven or safe harbors for criminal organizations to engage in ransomware attacks. What would the world look like if these individuals and groups did not have a safe haven in Russian territory?
The short answer is a lot different. Just as Herb finished mentioning a second ago, a lot of these bad actors do exist beyond our shores. With the full weight of law enforcement and the law enforcement community, it's difficult to stay in a safe place or a safe haven within the United States. But once you have a country that's sympathetic to your criminal acts and are providing that safe harbor, we do run into some very steep hills. And we're a law enforcement entity. Obviously, CISA, I like the phrase Matt used, the front door. That's a very appropriate way to put it. But we're not in the business of diplomacy or diplomatic efforts unilaterally. Obviously, we all have to be diplomats at times, but when it comes to working with other countries outside of a law enforcement capacity, even the law enforcement officials that we work with aren't going to do anything contrary to their leadership within country. So if we have that expectation, shame on us. But it makes it increasingly difficult, especially when where a lot of these bad actors are residing. And it is when you ask where does it kind of fit on the spectrum, it is one of the most paramount factors when it comes to bringing some of these bad folks to justice, because ultimately, like Mr. Stapleton was saying, our job is to get their hands off of keyboards and put handcuffs on them. And when there's an entity or a country in the business of impeding that justice being brought to bear, that's going to be a problem for us.
Todd, can I throw one more comment on top of what David just said? Because it's really important what he just said.
Please.
I think, when you look at it, while the current administration has made some really strong statements regarding safe harbors and what that looks like, I would point out something that's sometimes overlooked is that we have many more friends than we have enemies in the international community when it comes to ransomware. There are a number of really important partners that are willing to work with us to combat this problem. So you go back and look at things like the Emotet disruption, which was a broad disruption that involved law enforcement from many European partners. You go and look at the seizure of illicit proceeds from a NetWalker actor earlier this year, in which the Canadian authorities were key to that role. I think we've got a lot of opportunities for partnership and a lot of people who are very eager to be a part of this particular effort in the international community, and that's heartening.
Mm-hmm.
Matt, what are we hearing from the private sector? Are we seeing more interest in sharing with government? Are we seeing a greater demand signal for partnering? Is ransomware driving a different kind of public-private partnership than we've had?
Sorry about that, trying to get off mute real quick. I don't know that it is driving a different kind of partnership than we have seen in the past, but it is certainly bringing industry and government together, with a joint goal of really disrupting this real threat to our nation that we are seeing today. I think a common question that we're hearing from our private sector partners, especially small and medium-sized businesses, is What actions should they take today? And quite frankly, what role can the US government play in helping them both prevent or to help them respond and recover from cyber threats? And this is inclusive of, but not, solely related to ransomware attacks. So from our perspective at CISA, we are treating ransomware similarly to other cyber threats, and to address, left of boom activities, where we offer a number of resources that outline cyber hygiene steps that organizations can take to improve their cybersecurity. We offer assessments in cyber hygiene services, including vulnerability scanning services, web app scanning services, remote penetration testing services to organizations of all sizes, as long as they are US-based organizations. In terms of what we can do to assist right of boom, unfortunately, the answer is nothing if organizations don't share incident information with us. And by us, I mean broadly the US government. And that's an area that I know is on the top of mind of the Bureau of the Service and other government agencies. Is we are really looking to help private sector entities understand the importance of sharing information with the government. And really the reason why that we are pushing this is because it is our job to then look across sectors, to look across organizations, to look across industries, and even the federal government to understand whether similar attacks are occurring. So we can then alert critical infrastructure owners and operators about what they should be looking for and the steps that they can take to protect themselves. So for us to really begin to address this threat, we need all organizations, both public and private sector, really to consider the greater good. If no one shares, the same actors will be able to reuse the same tactics, tools, and procedures over and over again and cause significant harm in doing so. But as more entities begin to report incidents, the more that all of us on this panel, can do to protect other organizations and other sectors, and quite frankly, other nations. To us, it comes back to collective defense. This requires all of us. It requires partnership. At times, it requires selflessness. But we are seeing of late, and it is a positive trend, that there has been really good commitment from public and private sector entities. Once we are seeing, to Herb's point, reconstitution of certain botnets to really bring this information to the federal government and help address this national level problem.
Thanks. Let's talk for a minute about organizational relationships. We've got the Secret Service has the cyber fraud task forces. FBI has the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, NCIJTF, and CISA has CISA advisors around the country. How is coordination going? How is the partnering going at the federal level at this stage? And then I'm interested to hear next, how are relationships with state and local governments? What kind of information flows would be most helpful to get from them to make us stronger? And I open it up to anyone who would like to go first.
So I can start out with this one. Just like I mentioned before about the bad guys or the criminal enterprises working together as seamlessly as possible, it is also necessary for us to do that. So while there are several task forces, a number of task forces across the federal government, within the FBI, CISA, the public needs to know and have confidence that we're working together. And when the incidents such as Colonial or others are upon us, we're on the phone. I'm on the phone with Herb on the weekends, Matt and his colleagues. Whenever there's a major incident, you just feel confident that we're talking, because you have multiple companies that you can reach out to deliver your products. So the same is true for us in law enforcement and the cybersecurity business. We all gather information from a variety of sources, but when the time comes, we're sharing that information as needed in order to ultimately put some bad guys in jail or find some attribution. The Secret Service trains a ton of state and local law enforcement professionals through the National Computer Forensics Institute down in Hoover, Alabama. in one of my previous jobs as an inspector for the Secret Service, where I did periodic compliance audits, I talked to a ton of local law enforcement leaders throughout the country. And one of the primary things that they would say to me was how thankful they were that they had an opportunity to obtain some contemporary training. So it pretty much brought their law enforcement or law enforcement departments into the 21st century, if you will, in regards to not just, working on traditional crimes, violent crimes, but able to serve their constituents in a more contemporary criminal fashion. So it is very important for us to continue to build that capacity that Matt talked about earlier, and Herb as well, increasing, because there's only so many folks in the federal government, and in federal law enforcement, we only make up about 10% of law enforcement throughout the country. So 90% of those law enforcement professionals reside at the local, state and local level. And for us to be able to train them, as well as judges and prosecutors at the NCFI, the National Computer Forensics Institute, gives us that triangle of law enforcement, where you have the law enforcement professionals able to identify the crimes afoot, and then you have the judges and prosecutors able to prosecute those folks on the back end.
Herb, in my own background, I'm quite familiar with the NJTTF and the JTTFs out in the field, and the relationships with state and locals, with the fusion centers, et cetera. Is the model the same on the cyber side of the equation? And again, the question of what is the best what can state and locals be doing? What kind of information should they be doing? Initial intake and sharing, or should they be encouraging tips to be coming in? How, if you were speaking to a group of state and local governments about how to strengthen the information flow and the ability of the federal government to do enforcement, what would you be asking for?
So I think, to the first part of your question, the model is very similar. We've been intentional, especially as we begin to reshape the NCI-JTF and its contribution to this mission, to try to adopt some of those best practices that we've had with the very successful terrorism task force. The threat itself is different, and that's undeniable. And so as a result, when we're working with state and local entities, the results that are felt can sometimes be a little less tangible when we're talking about cyber attacks. Now, ransomware in particular brings that home in a tangible way that perhaps no other really cyber threat does. And so in a way, that the ransomware threat has resulted in a heightened interest from state and local entities in beginning to join up with this mission. I think if I were sort of having my opportunity to ask of state and local entities what they should do, I think number one, it would be to get somebody or more than one somebody in your department trained up on what cyber threats look like and how you can address those. I think David alluded to a really good program that the Secret Service has down in Hoover, Alabama, that trains local and state officers in this type of investigation, and the FBI has started to participate in that as well in a small way. We're very grateful for that opportunity, and so that's really a joint opportunity to work with the Secret Service and the FBI on those training matters. I'd say the second thing is, this is something that I think in the future we're all, as law enforcement, going to have to devote resources towards. And if you need any evidence of that, all you need to do is look at how many local police departments have been victims themselves of ransomware attacks over the course of the past year. This is not a crime problem or a cyber threat that we can just sort of say, we'll leave it to the federal government to handle that. It really requires a whole society effort. And then the last thing I'll mention in response to that question is, when you look at these, the three panelists on this particular call, each of us has a field presence, CISA field advisors, U.S. Secret Service field offices, FBI field offices. And you asked originally, what does the collaboration look like? And my answer to that would be better every day. Because what we're trying to do is be integrated in the way that we respond to these problems out in the field. And I think we're getting better and better at that as we go along. And I'm really proud of the collective progress that these three agencies have made in making that a unified effort.
Matt, can we resilience our way to reducing this problem? And if we can, to a certain extent, how much can we lower the temperature of ransomware attacks by being better on resilience and, I guess, our detection and mitigation?
So that is an interesting question. I don't think we can fully resilience our way out of it. I think this is going to require a whole of government approach that really uses the authorities, the tools, the expertise of all of the federal agencies, private sector partners, as well as organizations who are, quite frankly, those who are being impacted the most. So, when we discuss this problem, and we've had a number of interagency policy councils and such to discuss the problem, we're really thinking about countering ransomware along three primary lines of effort. Disrupting the ransomware operations, including payment schemes, the broader ecosystem. This is led by law enforcement agencies such as the Bureau and the service on the screen, as well as the Treasury Department and others. There is a component to this, which is really taking the fight to the enemy, which will require our intelligence community, will require law enforcement, as well as both diplomatic and military agencies working together. And then there's the third piece, which is resilience and hardening targets and making systems more secure. And that is the piece that CISA is focused on. So to answer your question, no, I don't think that alone is going to make a significant enough dent or prevent or reduce this risk. But I also don't think the other two components alone will satisfy what we need to do as a nation without the focus on hardening targets and the focus on resilience. So, in terms of our role at CISA, we remain focused on working collaboratively with all US-based organizations and international partners to really strategically strengthen the ecosystem over the long term. What that means in terms of real, day-to-day practice, we need to continue to ramp up our efforts on sharing alerts on new ransomware campaigns, like we did recently with the Bureau and the Department of Health and Human Services late last year, when there was credible information on threats to healthcare entities. We need to continue to provide best practices on how to prepare for and respond to ransomware incidents, which is something that guidance that we put out frequently, sometimes at CISA and as well as in partnership with the multi-state ISAC. And a good example of this is a webinar that we are hosting tomorrow for the private sector that walks through in very deep detail how to implement the recommendations that Deputy National Security Advisor Neuberger provided to industry last month. We really need to continue raising awareness of the threat, as well as awareness of what everyone can do. And we will continue as a US government to make it clear, what our various roles and responsibilities are and how we can assist all of our private sector partners in reducing the risk of ransomware.
I should say also, I want to offer question opportunities for our participants as well. I could ask about 10,000 more questions, and I will continue to ask questions, and we'll integrate some of the questions from the audience as well. David, it was mentioned already that Secret Service runs the National Computer Forensics Institute, and there's a lot of workforce development type of activities that are taking place there. How are we doing in terms of closing the gap in workforce capacity?
So the gap is increasingly closing, but going back to a phrase I said earlier, we're never going to get to ultimately being able to relax and rest. Like we just know that's not a reality. So just like a correctional officer in a prison has to always be mindful of what new ingenuity or innovative ways an inmate is going to try to use the tools in front of them to create havoc, we have to do that as well. So even though the gap is decreasing, we just know that we're just staying in front of the bad guys to the extent possible, because the landscape will continue to change. You know, we talked to some of the young agents. Herb and myself have been around the block for a few years now, but the agents that are 10, 15 years behind us, they're going to have a different threat than we do. So even though we continue to build the bench, as we like to say, within the agency, those folks that are in leadership positions 5-10 years from now, they will have a slightly or moderately different threat in front of them. So we continue to build the capacity, we continue to close the gaps, but that doesn't mean that the bad guys aren't going to continue to give us some additional avenues to be concerned about. And one thing I do want to add about one of the previous questions you asked, if I have time, the pandemic provided a great opportunity to show how much fusion we could have within the federal government, because at the end of the day, all of us had the same goal. So the pandemic fraud was upon us, and our friends at the FBI, CISA, we all worked together in order to thwart some of the threats that were coming at us and return a lot of this money to the American public that was being exploited by the bad guys. Because the bad guys, like Herb said earlier, they're in the business of monetizing whatever opportunities they can. And the pandemic is just one of those real life, very current situations that I can point to.
Yeah, no, we saw that a real tragic uptick in the attacks, ransomware attacks on hospitals.
Oh yeah,
and other sorts of
indeed.
caregiving institutions, and that was really, really unfortunate. Herb, when we look at ransomware, is this just derivative of malware, and this is just a new? Is there something different in ransomware than there is in any other kind of concerns we have about humans clicking on links or malware injects that lead to takeover? Is it really all in the same spectrum, or are we looking at something that is unique in malware? I'm sorry, within ransomware, obviously the payout strikes me as what's unique, but maybe I'm missing something in this.
So I guess I would kind of answer that question along two lines, and I would welcome Matt to jump in because he may have some perspective on this as well. But you know, from my standpoint, when you think about it, you know, ransomware is just a tool at the end of the day. It's not a threat in and of itself. It's just you know, it's a piece of code that tells your system that it's encrypted until you get a key and plug it in and decrypt that system. So it's really just as simple as that, and really kind of, I would say, not all that nothing new under the sun from a technical perspective. I think what makes it different is the way in which that particular scheme is monetized, because we see other types of digital extortion, whether it be like some of the ransom DDoS attacks that we've seen recently. We see other types of extortion where there's exfiltration of data, theft of sensitive data, and say, we'll release this unless you pay us. But those types of extortion are not nearly as financially successful, if you will, for the criminals as the ransomware piece is. And so I think that the disruptive effect of having all or many or most of your most critical systems unavailable to you provides tremendous leverage for the actor who is trying to extract money from a victim. And so that's what I would say is different. It's not different from a malware standpoint or from a TTP standpoint. It's very easy to understand, in my view, from that perspective. But what makes it successful is the leverage that can be exacted by the criminal gangs responsible.
So the profit really is an accelerator here.
Agree.
The more money you can make, the more people are going to get, and more entities that are going to get into this space. Matt, you've disillusioned me. We're not going to resilience our way out of this. We only have a few minutes remaining, and I want to give each of you a chance to both make closing remarks and also put to you, if you had an ask of Congress, either a resource or from an authority standpoint. We have a lot of Hill staff and members who are participating in this webinar today. What would you like to see in terms of the partnership with Congress to get us to a more effective place in preventing ransomware attacks? Matt, I'll start with you.
Sure. So, my sense is from an authority's perspective, I think we are in a good place in terms of legal barriers that we previously faced have largely been resolved. Moving forward, I think, two areas that we at CISA and elsewhere in the US government are interested in continuing to pursue to help critical infrastructure owners and operators both prepare for and defend against ransomware attacks left of boom, and also respond to and recover from ransomware attacks right of boom, are a cyber grants program, as well as the Cyber Response and Recovery Fund, which is something that, we, I think, have recognized a gap in federal resources following a declared cyber state of distress in terms of what we can do to help entities recover. So the Cyber Response and Recovery Fund would really ensure that the U.S. government has sufficient resources and authorities to help systemically important critical infrastructure entities, as well as state and local entities, rapidly recover from significant cyber incidents and rapidly reconstitute their business operations to reduce impact to our nation's citizens. This fund would flow through CISA to ensure that mitigation and asset response remains the priority. And we are working to mitigate the consequences of an attack by working with Congress to establish cyber incident reporting requirements. But like any other cyber threat to any other sector, ransomware is really no different. There is no silver bullet. There is no single technology that is going to prevent 100% of ransomware attacks or other threats from meeting their objectives. This is going to require multiple layers of protection, multiple layers of defense, integrated technology, as well as continued investment from Congress. So, we deeply appreciate Congress's commitment, and we look forward to continuing to work together with members to find the best path forward for funding and achieving our shared end goal.
David, Herb, in our remaining time, any sort of last thoughts about that on a wish list?
Wish list for entities or Congress or both?
For Congress in terms of authorities,
okay,
resources.
The resource element is paramount. Obviously, we've shown with cases like Roman Zeleznev and Alexei Burkov that with the right resources, we can bring even the Russian hosted or Russian harbored criminal actors to bear. Absent the resource piece, making sure we look at authorities that improve the timeliness and effectiveness of law enforcement investigations when it comes to transnational organized crimes, because we can't just be robust within our shores, we have to be robust beyond our shores.
Herb?
I'll keep mine really brief. I think that, like Matt said, we're incredibly encouraged by some of the feedback that we've gotten in briefings and other engagements that we've had with members of Congress and other parts of the government. And so we think there's a really bright future in the realm of cyber policy. I think, our number one goal here at the FBI that we think would help us the most is to take action that would encourage the reporting of ransomware incidents and ransomware payments. That's really the source through which we are able to pursue investigations. If we know that there has been an incident, and sometimes even more importantly, if we know that there has been a payment so that we can attempt to follow that money in some way, that's incredibly valuable to us. So any type of policy decisions that help make sure that that victims are reporting these crimes to the government is really going to help us out.
Well, as a former Hill staffer, those were very polite answers. And we're running out of time. First, I need to apologize to the questions we have in the queue that I did not get to. That's my fault. Second, I want to thank our speakers today, David Smith, Matthew Hartman, and Herb Stapleton. It's really been, I think, a terrific and lively conversation. And on behalf of Third Way, I appreciate all of our listeners' time today. We hope this was informative. Our goal was to raise understanding of the challenge, what it is not, what we can be doing to make the nation stronger against attacks or deter future attacks. And I think there was a wealth of ideas that were discussed today, and we look forward to future conversations. And also we encourage you to go to the National Security Program site for Third Way. We've got a fairly lengthy library of articles, pieces, and analysis on this issue, and we encourage you to remain in touch with all of us. So I want to thank you all today very much for your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.